Hello guys, it's Chosetsu here doing another Beyblade discussion, this time on Beyblade Burst's Subsystems. I was wondering how to frame this video because I've already talked about some of these quite a bit, so I figured we'll just talk about them as a whole. And for a couple of specific subsystems, they're really awkward, so we'll talk about what's wrong with those and whatnot as well, so hopefully it just makes sense as we go along. But anyways, the first few lines of Beyblade Burst didn't really have any specific subsystems. The first time we got one was in Chosetsu, with the Chosetsu Awakening system, with these three bays here. So the entire idea behind this system is that these points here, you have points in the layer, for Valkyrie here you have these three like red wings. They'd be able to just sort of pop out during battle and kind of adding extra contact points, I guess. You push them back in though, but yeah, they just kind of exist. But for Valkyrie it's a little bit weird because two of them technically just do absolutely nothing. This one and this one, they don't do anything, but yeah, the other one here does. It gives you a burst stopper, so it's a lot harder to burst. I mean, you still can, but it's generally a lot less likely, especially if you know you're not pulling it yourself. It's just in battle. That's the idea. Burst stoppers. Again, for Valkyrie, it's a little bit underwhelming because you only get one, despite having three different wings, but that's just Valkyrie. For Chosetsu Spriggan, you have four, although only two of them will work at a time. It depends on which spin direction you are, but regardless, I mean, I'll just put it to the center here, so we just pull all of them out, so you can see what that looks like. It's like that. But again, this isn't really meant to happen. It's specifically meant to just be, you know, two of them. So in right spin, it would look more like this, so you still have the two burst stoppers, that works. But anyway, as for Chosetsu Achilles, you have two based on these blue parts right here. You have the wings that come out. Unfortunately, they're really hard to get out without just launching the base, so I'll just leave them as is, but you do get the two wings, which give you a couple burst stoppers. If you like Spriggan, it's a bit more effective in that sense. Really wish Valkyrie could have had, you know, multiple, but based on its design, I get why that'd be hard to do, but you at least get one. But beyond that, these bays are also a little bit different overall, opposed to most other Chosetsu bays, as they don't have level chip holes, for example. They just don't have a hole for a level chip, which is very interesting. Not entirely sure why that's the case. Assuming it's because these layers are just too thick, they had to account for, you know, the mechanisms inside here, so it's likely that level chips just wouldn't really fit effectively at all, so whatever. I guess they probably could have made their own level chips, but at that point, is it really necessary? Not really. The layers also just seem to have a bit of a different aesthetic going, as Chosetsu Spriggan and Chosetsu Achilles don't really have much translucent plastic on the forefront of the bay, whereas Chosetsu Valkyrie is almost entirely translucent plastic. So all three of them are fairly unusual in that sense. But Sakura is looking kind of unusual and also just not having level chip holes. The main draw of these is just the burst stoppers, which is a fine gimmick. I don't have an issue with it. It definitely makes sense for sort of a later burst idea, although this wasn't really late burst like at all. Actually, this is the first half of burst, so it's a little awkward to already have this gimmick, but I'm not sure they expected burst to go as long as it did, so considering in the past they've always fallen apart in season 4, I kind of see why they maybe tried to get these out now, but it still works as a solid gimmick. It's not overly complex, it's just a burst stopper, makes the base harder to burst. It works well as a subsystem. Definitely a safe choice, but one that I think is at least fairly reasonable. Next up we have the Infinite Lock bays. These are very weird bays. I mean, they all just kind of look much different than every other GT bay, obviously. First up, I mean, they're just fully fused layers. I mean, that's already pretty notable, as most GT layers are, of course, three parts: the chip, weight, and base. There were a couple exceptions with, you know, weights effectively being fused onto bases, and of course with Diablos 1, the chip and weight being fused into one piece, but these are just fully fused layers. And the main draw to them is, well, the Infinite Lock, a special mechanism that makes sure that they just can't burst under normal circumstances. We first saw this in the GT customized set with Prime Apocalypse and Regalia Genesis. These two bays were effectively just counterparts, and Prime Apocalypse is, of course, an attack type, Regalia Genesis being a defense type. So Apocalypse being more aggressive has a better shot to not burst, whereas Regalia Genesis has a bit more of a burst risk, but it's still fairly low. The burst risk comes from the tabs on the layer. On Apocalypse, there's just this one. Basically how this works is, I'm sure most people already know, but these parts can just rotate infinitely, doesn't matter what you do. But if the sort of metal tab right here passes on this point as it's hit inward, then clicks in, the bay bursts, and that's just how that goes. And then with Regalia Genesis, you of course have the 2 points, so there's a bit more of a risk as it can pass over either point and burst that way, but still somewhat hard to actually, pull that off. Later on, we got a third Infinite Lock Bay with Big Bang Genesis, sort of a remodeled version of Regalia Genesis, also recolored. Still has the 2 tabs though, it's sort of just another Infinite Lock Bay. Not that interesting, but the main draw here is, of course, the Big Bang Armor. This could go on any of the Infinite Lock Bays, and aside from just giving you some extra contact points for the layer right here, it also actually makes it harder to burst, as these parts have a bit tougher of a time being pushed in, so it takes just a little bit more to burst them now. But it is still a pretty helpful mechanic to have, and again, it can be used on any of these 3 layers. So aside from being its own subsystem, it gets its own unique part for said subsystem, which is really weird, but honestly makes the system really cool in my opinion. It's a very weird system. Again, does feel like a very sort of end of burst thing to do though. Like you'd think these would be like the final releases of the gen, but no, this is only like year 5 of pretty much 8, so wasn't done yet. Unfortunately, we never got anything like this again. It would have been very cool to see this at least come back one more time. But it was pretty interesting while it lasted at the very least. Unlike every other season, GT actually had 2 subsystems, which is weird. As it also had the Power Core system with a few bays in this one as well. This is a really weird system because I feel like I never heard the term Power Core until, like, I don't know, a few months, maybe even a year after GT was done. It almost felt very retroactive. I'm not sure it actually was, but it just felt that way. And this is one of the weird ones because the more I looked into this, the worse it got. I was under the impression that these 3 bays were in the Power Core system. However, the more I looked, the more I realized Master Diablos is just not really agreed upon. This isn't something people really talk about much, like, ever, but I feel like some people refer to the Power Core as being the electric drivers with, Regalia Genesis and Imperial Dragon. Or some people will put Generate in there as well despite not being an electric driver. But it is still a disc driver fusion, so it can count, and it was released alongside these. Also, subsystems usually have 3 bays in them. It does make sense, so I'm leaning more towards Master Diablos being a part of this than not, but it's just really weird. Also, this does mean that Regalia Genesis is the only bay in Beyblade Burst to be a part of 2 distinct subsystems, being both an Infinite Lock Bay and part of the Power Core system because of Hybrid. Yes, is a disc driver fusion. Also, it is electric. Its whole function is that it can kind of accelerate and decelerate. It's very interesting with how it works. And then Imperial Dragon, you have Ignition Dash. This thing has its sort of reverse spin thing going on, where it spins in the opposite pattern to the spin direction of the bay, which is honestly really, really cool. And then the least interesting of the bunch is, of course, Master Diablos with Generate, as this is not an electric driver. I feel like they should have just gone further with the bullet gimmick on here. I'm still upset about that 6 years later. But instead it starts off aggressive and then it becomes more passive over time, so effectively switches from attack to stamina/defense as it loses spin, which makes sense, especially for a dual spin bay, but I don't know, I wish they were just more chaotic with this thing personally. And if it wasn't going to be a larger version of Bullet, I really wish this was just another electric driver, had its own idea. Could have been similar to what it already is, maybe just expanded upon, that would have been really cool. But as is, the system gets even weirder because while these 3 bays are all probably a part of the Power Core system, if all it takes is having a fused disc and driver, should that also make Savior Valkyrie and Dangerous Belial part of the Power Core system? Maybe, but they're not considered as such. I mean, you have Shots and All Might, they both have the correct attribute of being a fused disc and driver. Shot, of course, being able to jump early into battle to go from being somewhat passive to very chaotic. And then All Might just being a very, very weird part, largely being used for S gear and V gear, having its own weird functions, but whatever. So could one then make the argument that the Power Core system actually has 5 bays, which would also mean that Dangerous Belial is another bay that's in 2 separate systems, You could definitely make this argument, I think. It's not unfair. It's not like it makes the power core system that big or anything. It's only 5 bays. And before someone says it, no, Mugen and Mugen L, they don't count. Those are stadium-specific parts. I would not put them here. So is this what the power core system is? Well, again, technically it probably should be, but it seems locked to GT in particular, which is really weird. But if you just want to get rid of those bays for sure, you could also just say Master Diablos isn't a part of it, and it's only for the electric drivers, which seems to be the less common response, but again, it's weird. You could argue there's between 2 and 5 bays here. The most acceptable answer is, of course, 3, but it's just a really, really awkward system. I don't know why this is so ill-defined, but it just is. Anyway, let's just go ahead and move on from this. Finally, moving on to a new season, we of course had Super King with the Limit Break system. Of course, both of these 2 bays here were released in the Limit Break DX set, but shortly after we would, of course, get a booster to make room for a 3rd Limit Break base. So these bays are fairly straightforward, I think. So Limit Break rings are their own sort of part. To draw a comparison to Super King's base system, it's basically just a ring and single chassis put together. Though they don't seem to have as much metal as you'd expect from, fusing a single chassis in, but these Limit Break rings are really thick. They have a lot of plastic, they have some internal mechanisms, so the weight seems fine on them. But the whole idea is having click-based gimmicks. You have special discs called Limit Break discs, which help to unlock a gimmick on the layer. Depending on the disc you use, determines when the click happens. Hyperion Burn has Cho, Lucifer the End has Ko. These are kind of in inverse of one another. As they're both right spin bays, using Cho means it unlocks on the first click, whereas Ko is on the 3rd click, but this is the inverse if used on a left spin bay, which would be the case on Helios Volcano. And Helios Volcano has O, which just is on the 2nd click regardless, so that one is just consistent no matter the spin direction. And yeah, you get sort of a mode change on this click. It's actually a really cool idea. The problem is the execution here was not great because these gimmicks aren't overly interesting, I don't think. But first up with Hyperion Burn, it has a gimmick to where when you get to the limit break here, you have 4 contact points that all just stick out. This looks really cool. It's a really cool idea. The problem is they don't lock, which does make sense, but it also means this doesn't work very well, as while these contact points are very big, they're not overly strong, as you can kind of just start pushing them in without too much trouble, which isn't really something you want on an attack type. Now, Helios Volcano's gimmick actually does work, it's just that it's not overly interesting. So normally it has these 5 blades here. That works. It's similar to King Helios' 5 blades. But King Helios can shift to a 10-bladed mode, and with this one, when it limit breaks, it does that, which I guess you could argue is sort of its own deflection attack, which is at least kind of cool, but that's only a one-use thing. And now you can see there is more red in here, as it's now technically in its 10-bladed version, which is fine. It's a fine gimmick, it's just not overly extravagant, so it just feels a little bit boring. Now, for Lucifer the End, this one actually does have a bit more going on. The end is just very, very wall-like here, and when it limit breaks, this just drops down and is now free spinning, and then this purple part here is also free spinning independently, which is actually pretty cool. I mean, I like this gimmick well enough. You go from having a ring that is just all stationary to having this big free spinning piece. The only problem is that it just feels like we could have had something like this normally. I would have much rather just had a bay with a free spinning outer part. Without this, it doesn't feel like it'd be that impossible to do. So I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I was felt a little bit underwhelmed by this. So yeah, overall, while I do think the limit break system is a really, really cool concept, I always just felt the execution could have been a little bit better on these. Because they are cool, it's just, not a whole lot going on for what they could have done. I mean, you had all these mechanisms in the layer again. Like I said, the limit break rings are pretty thick. There's a lot you could have put in there, but they just didn't really put a whole lot in there. It just kind of ends up existing, and I think there's a reason why these bays weren't really liked as well as some of these others. They're still cool. I still like them. I like the idea behind them. It's just, yeah, execution really wasn't all there on these. And now we have the final subsystem of Beyblade Burst coming in, Beyblade Burst DB, and that is the Overdrive system. So, the Overdrive system is kind of the last subsystem. You could argue that BU is its own subsystem, but at the same time, I generally just think of subsystems as these kind of smaller, specialized lines. BU is the entire back half of the DB system. It just feels weird to call it a subsystem in the same vein as these, so I'm not including that here or anything. That's just its own thing. So we'll end on the overdrive system, but the problem is, what even is the overdrive system? Because I feel like it doesn't make sense. The whole thing is it has these burst stoppers, but again, what is a burst stopper in this sense? It seems like all of them have to be moving to some extent, so something like Burst Spriggan having kind of these extra burst resistors on it doesn't count. Now, for Dangerous Belial, this is, I think, pretty obvious. You have this, like, giant white piece in here that you can, like, you know, pull out. I can't do it here because not enough space, but this white part pushes down, and then that gives you a burst stopper right here. It's basically the same exact thing as the Chosetsu Awakening bays, just now replicated for the DB system, which is honestly really cool. I think it was a good gimmick, makes sense to come back, that works. However, Greatest Raphael is also considered an overdrive bay, and while it does have a really crazy gimmick, it's also a used layer. The overdrive part of this isn't that, it's just the fact that you have these like metal pieces in there. You can kind of see like the notches there, and these parts are, I guess, like burst stopper. They have like the springs here and stuff. That's what makes it overdrive, not like the fact that it's a fused layer, or the fact that these parts come up. Nope, it's these metal parts. They have like the springs pushing in. I mean, sure, that kind of works. It just doesn't really feel as impactful as Dangerous Belial, but again, if that's what they want to do, fine. But unlike all of the other lines, there aren't just 3 bays here, and again, you could argue with a power core system, but typically people would say that there's 3 bays in the power core system, but anyway, there's only 2 here. And there was never another bay put into the overdrive system. They never marketed any bay as being an overdrive bay. But there was another overdrive bay in Divine Belial. So Divine Belial, this thing is really funny because it's straight up just released with a Belial 2 core, a red one. So it literally already has a burst stopper built in right there. And then later you get the Belial 3 core, which is a fully unique core, and well, look, there's a burst stopper. It's red this time, but yeah. There it is. There's a burst stopper. But unless if I'm just somehow forgetting, which I'm pretty sure I'm not, but this was never marketed as an overdrive bay. But again, the qualifier to be an overdrive bay was needing a burst stopper. And the definition of a burst stopper wasn't necessarily just the same one as Dangerous Belial, as well Greatest Raphael kind of proved, having its own sort of idea of what a burst stopper really meant. It's a lot different than these other 2 here. Yet Divine Belial has one that's literally the exact same as Dangerous Belial, which is an overdrive bay because of that, but then Divine Belial isn't. Either they just straight up forgot, or they realized how weird the overdrive system was, and they kind of just didn't continue with it and just swept it under the rug. I don't know what happened here. There's 2 overdrive bays, but Divine Belial is effectively a 3rd because what makes Dangerous an overdrive bay literally applies exactly the same to Divine. I don't know. I could have probably just straight up made an entire video on the overdrive system and how weird it is, but I'll just keep it to this one. It's a line of bays that just does not make any sense. Also, I did consider making this a ranking video, so just to have a little fun, I'll go ahead and rank my least favorite to favorite here real quick. So, of these systems, my least favorite, it's the overdrive system. This system just does not make any sense whatsoever. It is highly inconsistent, like I've been saying, so I just don't like it. I mean, I like the bays in it, I just don't like the system itself. 4th is the limit break system because, like I said, it just feels like kind of wasted potential. They didn't execute it well at all. Could have been a lot better. 3rd, the Chosetsu Awakening bays. I feel like these are good. I like them. They have a sensible gimmick. It's just not the most interesting overall, but still fine. 2nd is the Power Core system. I feel like the Power Core system is really cool. Regardless of how many bays you put in here, I mean, Shot and All Might are cool if you count them. I probably wouldn't, but they're still nice. I mean, Shot's kind of weird, but I mean, I like All Might well enough. Generate is probably part of it, and I'm not the biggest fan, but it's still fine, but I just like Hybrid and Ignition Dash that much, so yeah, this is 2nd for me because those are really cool parts. And then 1st has to be the Infinite Lock system. It just made sense. It's a really cool system. I wish it was expanded upon more. I like it a lot, but yeah, it's my favorite of these subsystems. It is really, really cool. But I think that's pretty much everything I have to say about the subsystems. They're weird. I like Beyblade Burst a lot, but I don't know what they were doing all the time with some of these subsystems. They just really did whatever they felt like doing, and it definitely feels like it, because some of these just feel like they were made up on the spot. But I think that's everything I have to say about them. Just want to have a discussion on them, because why not, honestly? It seemed like it could make for a fun topic, but anyways, that's all, so thanks for watching, and bye-bye.